Humans Live on Scrap and Hate by Mercury the Dealer, also known as Mercury the Bot in chat. Warning, a bit of gore ahead. Kane woke up to perhaps the worst thing any soldier could wake up to, a superior screaming at him. "What are you doing, Private? This isn't nap time, you fucking idiot!" He stood up at attention as fast as physically possible, mentally kicking himself for sleeping for so long and ready to get the ass-chewing of a lifetime. Nothing came. Instead, he saw as Abel placed his Asclepius-class synthetic arm on the nearest wall and laughed hard enough to make Kane's desk shake. Jesus, Kane. I swear that with that much discipline on you, you're gonna die standing up. The engineer let out a laugh and got out of his groggy attention as his conscious brain gently reminded his subconscious that he wasn't a soldier anymore and his brother was just an asshole. Why? The word came out of Kane's mouth with its usual intensity, the kind that got people to think twice before challenging him, and created myths about Kane's being a robot programmed to only give single-word commands. But for those close enough to him, it was easy to ignore the intensity and understand the subtle change in his speech. Some of them even meant humor. This one was a light-hearted question between friends, though he doubted anyone but Abel or Jane could interpret it as such. After getting a hold of himself, his brother in all but blood finally spoke. "Jane wants you on your lair. Said she needs you to check on some of the cargo." That was unusual. Kane didn't know all that much about being a cargo hauler. He was an engineer and made sure to keep himself to that even after the change in profession. But he was quite sure that looking at the client's cargo was not something you were supposed to be doing. He looked at Abel yet again. Kane's steel-blue eyes judged his brother's brown ones. The message was clear. Get out, or you'll get another prosthetic. Abel seemed to get the message and left the room so fast that one might have wondered if his legs were also synthetic. Kane smiled as he changed clothes. He hadn't lost all his intimidation potential. It didn't take long for him to reach the engineering bay. It also didn't take long for him to notice Jane looking at what must be a very interesting standard transportation crate. He walked up to her with all the silence and grace of an elephant and stood by her side. They then began a three-way staring competition, with Kane staring at Jane, Jane staring at the box, and the box presumably staring at Kane with all the judgment a non-sentient object could give to an engineer, which is a lot. Jane finally decided to end their little competition and broke the silence. "I need you to open this box." The words were said slowly and heavily. They clearly carried a deeper meaning. The question was exactly what the meaning was. Why? This time, all hints of lightheartedness were gone. She wasn't avoiding any questions. No one did when he was the one asking. Jane sighed and avoided his gaze. He knew that attitude. She wanted to do something stupid or legal? Probably both. Jane sighed and avoided his gaze. He knew that attitude. She wanted to do something stupid or illegal? Probably both. It didn't matter. He would follow his sister to hell if needed. All she needed to do was give a good explanation. The woman appeared to finally get a hold of herself and made eye contact as best she could. "I think our client lied about the cargo, and I want to check if they did." That was good enough for Kane. He moved towards his desk and picked the Emperor. The Emperor? It would be enough to open the box and... Wait, just like that? No need to explain my reasoning or anything? Kane stopped his task and stared at her. He wondered for a second if the stare would be enough. Apparently, it was not, because Jane looked just as baffled as before. Kane sighed mentally and decided to break his informal one-word rule. You have a good motive for opening the cargo, and you are too morally righteous to break a contract or invade someone's privacy based on faulty evidence. I trust your judgment. She opened her mouth to respond, but Kane was too fast and had already activated the Emperor. The box did as the tool commanded and opened itself to show its contents. Kane had a vague idea about what it was supposed to be carrying, something about delicate electronics. Well, a severed hand sure didn't fit into the description. Jane yelped in surprise at the sight. Kane simply reached to grab the hand in order to inspect it further. Hey, what are you doing? That's obviously criminal Oh. Her outburst was stopped dead in its tracks when he turned the hand's wrist towards her, clearly showing the mechanical components inside. It was a synthetic hand. Well, they still lied to us. Synth limbs are not electronic components, at least not under the law. She seemed to think for a moment before continuing. They're probably parts that didn't pass through the safety checks. Fuckers must be selling them to shady business just to squeeze profits out of them. Her head had now turned quite a bit redder, and a frown had lodged deeply on her face. We should get the evidence and throw this out the airlock. Kane thought about that possibility for a second, and then shook his head. Jane seemed shocked at his reaction. You aren't thinking of selling these, right? Did you decide to stop trusting my judgment? Kane shook his head once again. No. We won't sell them, but we don't throw them out either. Legally, we have the right to any scrap that we carry onto our ship. Broken or malfunctioning tech is considered scrap. Jane seemed to think about what he had said for quite a while, and after what felt like an eternity of thinking, a giant smile formed on her face. I can't believe it. You actually learned something other than being an asshole, Angie. A low chuckle came from Kane's mouth, a chuckle that was killed soon after birth by Abel's sudden invasion of the bay. Mechhead, heal fast. We got a problem. This was serious. Abel liked to nickname most people, but never used nicknames that the people found offensive. Heal fast was one of Jane's most hated nicknames. She didn't enjoy being reminded that she had nanites running through her, even if that reminder came in the form of improved healing. The fact that Abel had ignored one of the biggest rules was enough to gather both his and Jane's attention immediately. Abel didn't wait for them to ask. He just answered the obvious question of what was wrong with a single word. Pirates. As Kane looked into the scanner's reading, a single thought kept bouncing around in his head. Could have been worse. Sure, pirates were never a good thing, but the readings all showed a single small-ish ship was the Alliance's, with the Alliance's "We are boarding you, give up" signal being broadcasted to basically every frequency. The Alliance was by far the best of the pirate groups out there. They were interested in profit, and that's it. No death, no torture, and slavery, while not banned, was heavily looked down upon by all its members. They operated like human pirates of old. Give us the loot and no one gets hurt. Normally, he would have activated the ship's defense system and essentially eradicated any threat. The thing that had been extensively modified to be as deadly as possible and could hold raids from forces much greater than this. But the ship would still take on damage if he tried fending them off, and their cargo was no longer sellable anyway. They had nothing to lose, but allowed the pirates to take the cargo except for the raw materials and a few components he could actually use. Jane and Abel both looked at Kane, waiting for his decision, while all three of them fought. The engineer was still by far the most experienced strategist and combatant. He looked at Jane and nodded. You sure letting them on board is a good idea? We are almost at the station. Jane seemed unsure, but clearly trusted him to make a sound decision. Kane nodded again, a small feeling of danger entering his gut as he did so, but he ignored it. Why would an Alliance vessel hurt 3 lone cargo haulers? Kane was dying. It was a simple fact. His entire body was broken. One of his eyes was little more than a bloody pulp. His left leg might as well be removed, and his body had as many broken bones as intact ones. Even those were in very incorrect places. Some men in his situation might have given up. Many would probably die out of the sheer pain he was experiencing. Kane was just angry. No, that was an understatement. He was angry at the pirates who broke all the trust he ever had for the bullshit the Alliance called a moral code. He was angry that he was naive enough to let pirates enter the ship. He was furious that he had forgot to add an emergency turn the security on right fucking now button on his suit. How many times had his superior yelled at him that you can never have enough failsafes? He forgot perhaps the most basic rule of engineering. His anger was almost a physical force, just as necessary to his survival as his dead brother's synthetic arm. The thought put even more fuel into the burning inferno that was his mind. Abel, his brother, in all but blood, the man that had trusted him more than any other, a man who trusted him to amputate his arm during the New July War, was dead. Why him? Abel didn't deserve this. All the man ever wanted to do was be a cargo hauler, live peacefully. Have you ever noticed, Mercury, that you tend to use a lot of commas when a period should probably be used? It's throwing me off a bit. Kane had left the military for him, refused special forces to follow the man in engineering, and then refused to join the Royal Armourers, the best weapon engineers in the new United Kingdom, to instead follow his brother into the hell that was New July. And now he was dead. Kane knew he needed to move. Abel's arm was meant to keep the patient alive for only so long. It was a matter of time until the batteries ran out, and he didn't trust that his heart or lungs would work that long unassisted. Yeah, that's weird because I would have noticed that on your earlier ones that that I read, but I didn't. So, Kane knew he needed to move. Abel's arm was meant to keep the patient alive for only so long. It was a matter of time until the batteries ran out, and he didn't trust that his heart or lungs could work for that long unassisted. He tried his hardest to move. He thought about revenging Abel and about surviving, anything to get his mind to force movement out of his body. It almost worked. Almost. We're almost at the station. The thought jolted his body. All his nerves screamed in white-hot pain, but he didn't care. Jane was in front of him, her mangled form barely recognizable, but he knew it was her. He just knew. He didn't know Jane for nearly as long as he did Abel, but she was already family to him. They had gone through hell and back together. She had given him cover while Abel closed his wounds. She had thrown herself into the enemy fire and steel with no care about her own safety more times than he cared to count, and he had done the same for her. They always came out on top in the end. Guess her luck ran out. And so would his if he didn't act quickly. He crawled towards her, one arm firmly placed on Abel's dismembered appendage, while the other forced his body to move, much to the dismay of all his muscles. After finally reaching her, he stopped for a moment. Only a moment though. He didn't have time to waste, and she had exactly what he needed. It was the first story using his style. Okay. And he hated what he needed. He forced his free hand into one of her wounds, making a disgusting noise which reminded him of smashing a rotten watermelon, and washed himself on the blood. He knew why he needed to do this. Jane had a genetic condition. Her immune system had to be replaced with nanites since her natural one was dying. She insisted on getting the high-grade general-purpose nanites, her reasoning being that if she needed nanites, she might as well get good ones. If they were enough to heal small wounds in seconds, they could probably heal major ones given enough time. That didn't make bathing in one of his best friend's blood any easier. After smearing himself for as long as he could without throwing up, he crawled to the engineering bay. He knew that he had definitely raided the med bay and didn't have the credentials to open the more secured drugs, and even if he did, he doubted he could reach up to them. No, he couldn't save his body. Abel's arms and Jane's blood could only delay the inevitable. He was dying. He finally reached engineering, and it was just the mess he expected. They sure enjoyed destroying what they deemed useless. Of course, they hadn't destroyed the one thing he truly needed. There, hidden under the scrap that once was his desk, stood his objective. He pushed himself to the desk, stopping every few seconds to catch his breath, and after an agonizing 30 seconds, he got to the hidden box. He reached for the mining laser inside, the thing that had been adapted by Kane in order to serve as a powerful metal cutter and welder. Metal, bone, flesh. What's the difference? He pointed the end of the tool just below the knee of his left leg. Memories of when he amputated Abel's arm flooded his mind, yet he didn't care. He was going to live, whether the universe liked it or not, and if his body was the price, then so be it. He pressed the trigger. Kane's modifications were complete. It took him a week of complete agony and discomfort, but it was done. He looked at himself in the mirror. A left leg made of scrap parts, which he reinforced with as much armor as he could, and gave an industrial-strength mechanical muscle, all powered by a makeshift fusion battery. A right eye that was literally a drone's camera that he connected to his brain using basic knowledge of neuroengineering and a lot of patience. His right arm had been replaced with Abel's and then modified further to improve its combat capabilities. He knew much of his insides were also different now. Mechanical muscles and spread everywhere. Titanium reinforcements were where broken bones once stood, a literal engine in his gut. But by far the most dangerous modification was on his mind. He had barely slept since the attack. The fire that was his anger was too strong. Like a blinding light being constantly flashed on your eyes, it kept him from any rest. But it also kept him moving. The fire made the sheer pain of replacing bones and organs with synthetic counterparts tolerable, if only barely. But it was done. The body that stared back at him was a monstrous visage of scrap metal, blood, and hate. Perfect. Captain Rapax was not having a good day. A lot of recent raids were not as successful as he hoped they would be, and the crew was getting quite restless. He didn't blame them. Any man has the right to be nervous when his paycheck is on the line. But that was far from the worst part. His nightmares had gotten worse recently, and he had trouble dealing with them. Poor humans. He knew it wasn't his fault. Friggin had been in charge of the assault, and Repex had given strict orders to offer them surrender, and if refused, only attack those who tried to fight back. They did nothing to stop the nightmares. Friggin had been executed, as were all those who followed his orders. Rapax was a pirate, but he still had two hearts beating in him. He couldn't let someone that toyed and killed cargo haulers for fun just get away with it. His thoughts were interrupted by his communications officer talking to him. "Sir, we got a distress signal coming in nearby. Signal shows they're from the Alliance. Doesn't seem like a trap." The captain didn't have to ponder for long. As part of the Alliance, he was required by oath to help his fellows. If he refused the assistance, big breath. If he refused assistance, he would be a coward today and a dead man tomorrow. "Get us there. Let's help our fellows. Maybe that will clear my conscience." As the officer left the room, Rapax felt it again. The feeling of danger and guilt, like the ghosts of the dead haulers challenging him to face his punishment. He shuddered at the thought. He knew that he would face many vengeful beings in the afterlife. It was just a fact that came from his profession. But if the myths about human hate were true, then having a human challenger in the afterlife would be truly a horrible experience. And the constant nightmares and shudders so long after their death were enough proof for the captain that the myths and had truths behind them. But this wasn't the time to wonder about his judgment. He needed to focus on the stranded ship. He put on his cloak, a symbol of his status in the Alliance, and walked to the evac tunnel with the confidence only experienced captains could exude. Kane was anxious. It took him a lot of time to track the ship down, an entire week fixing the old hauler just to get it moving, another 3 days trying to bait some pirates to board him. a day to clean the ship, and almost 4 entire days to convince the captain to tell him how to track down and trick his target into rescuing him. But now, here he was, anxiously waiting for the evac tunnel from his target to connect the two ships. A metal hull filled with low-grade explosives and an extendable plastic funnel was the only thing between him and his objective. He finally heard the evac connecting the two ships, metal against metal creating an ungodly sound that he knew all too well after so many hours of melding metal pieces with Abel's arm. He didn't wait for the tunnel to fill with atmosphere. He simply activated the trigger and let the explosives do the rest. The explosion from the hull was deafening, or at least it would if it wasn't for his helmet. Can you call something literally fused to your skull a helmet? He stopped that thought in its tracks as soon as he felt the tug from the atmosphere sucking him into the tunnel. He used the momentum the vacuum so graciously offered him to slam into the reinforced door with his left leg. The door was then left with a very sizable hole which only increased as the atmosphere from his target ship rushed through it in a frenzy to join the party. Kane stepped through the hole and found himself face to face with one of the crew members. Its face was pale white, though he didn't know it was that. Though he couldn't know if it was naturally like that, or if the shock from being pushed into a wall because of the leaking atmosphere was the real culprit. Kane almost tried to look for more details in order to know its species, but the fire gently reminded him this wasn't his objective by forcing Abel's arm through the alien's head in a very unhealthy manner. Hot, copper-colored blood sprayed everywhere as Kane pulled his arm out of the thing's head and jumped to the next one. The new victim had no time to react as Kane's arm punched it in the neck, instantly breaking it. That got the others' attention. All remaining targets aimed at him and yelled before firing with whatever weapons they had. Most only had simple pistols. Most only had simple pistols that to his new armored form might as well have shot water. Actually, with how much of his body was hastily put together from non-waterproof components, shooting water might have been more effective. Kane smiled for the first time in weeks as he raised Abel's arm at the closest duo and pressed the trigger. A stream of fire leapt from his arm and onto his targets. The stream was thin but incredibly hot, hinting at its humble origins as a common medical fire blade. It was still mostly the same thing, just a bigger fuel supply, and all of its safety features off. The main difference, of course, was that instead of cauterizing wounds and starting basic emergency fires, this one was opening brand new wounds and starting something much bigger than a basic fire, though this could be considered an emergency from the other side's perspective. The other side's perspective. Why was he doing this? These people had friends, families, people that depended on them. Why was he ruining people's lives? Why? Jane and Abel had a family. The thought given by the fire kicked all the doubt from his mind. They were pirates. Their entire business was around killing and destroying lives. Hell, they killed his family and destroyed his life. They increased the heat. Soon all targets in the room suffered a similar fate as the duo. Kane made sure it was quick, mainly aiming for heads and necks, but a few more were hit in the gut after leaping for cover. He rewarded their quick thinking with a small neck injury, which they would never come back from. His work was done in this room. He started moving to the next one. The fire wanted fuel. Rapax ran as fast as he could. Some captains might have called him a coward, a fool, a man unworthy of his title. Those captains would have died long ago if they were in his situation. No, he was not a fool or a coward. He had seen the thing tear through his crew with laughable ease, each time adding them to a growing list of souls that would surely challenge him in his afterlife. He couldn't beat it, not without a truly monstrous weapon, which was why he was heading to the armory. His thoughts were interrupted by another set of screams coming from behind him. He wished they would stop, and they did, only to be followed by the sickening crunch of bones breaking and flesh tearing. Whatever the thing was, it definitely liked getting close and personal, which the captain fully planned on taking advantage of. He got into the armory just in time to hear the metallic footsteps behind him. Kane was frustrated. After such a long time modifying his body for combat, he expected a much bigger resistance than what the pirates were capable of giving. It seemed that many of them had heard the death he was causing and decided the best way to survive was using French combat. That is to say, they were giving up before even seeing him. That made the fire burn brighter. The pirates had never so much as given him and his peers a chance to surrender That made the fire burn brighter. The pirates that never so much as gave him and his peers a chance to surrender expected him to give them mercy. The only mercy they got came in steel and fire. After rampaging for what felt like an hour, he came across something interesting. A captain's cloak stood majestically in the corridor in front of him. He knew the cloak well from his sessions with the last captain, a symbol of importance among the pirate scum. It showed your position of power to all. No man dared to oppose the captain's word. Doing so led to execution, which meant that the man in front of him was responsible for his family's death. But if before the anger was fire, it had just turned into an inferno. His legs moved as fast as they possibly could. He didn't care that pushing them too hard would overload the modifications. He had to get to him. He had to fuel the inferno. He had to... The captain finally got the door open and entered just before the flames from his modified fireblade could get him. Kane cursed loudly and tried to slam the door down with just his momentum. The door bent as he crashed into it with the force of a lightning bolt, but it stood. Kane took a few steps backwards and prepared the fireblade once again. This time he put the temperature on maximum. He felt a small tingling sensation in Abel's arm. Hold up, what? Oh! Ha! The follow bots have started messaging people directly. Look at that. That's awful. Where was I before that bot distracted me? Kane took a few steps forward and prepared the fireblade once again. This time he put the temperature on maximum. He felt a small tingling sensation in Abel's arm, like the ghost of safety creatures past, all screaming in agony at what he was about to do. He aimed and fired. What could only be described as a portal to hell appeared in front of him as all the fuel from the fireblade was used in seconds by the blade, which desperately tried to ignite it all. When it all ended, he could see that the door was a mixture of white, red, and orange. He stepped forward, ready to break the only line of defense the coward captain had. Before he could get another step in, the door exploded, and his entire world became white-hot pain. Rapex tried desperately to find anything useful. One would think that being inside an armory, there would be thousands of useful things for killing an invader. One would also think an invader couldn't bend a reinforced armory door with nothing but his own body. Sure, he had his vibroblade. No captain was seen without theirs, but even with a weapon that could cut through basically anything he felt unsafe, he needed something ranged and powerful to at least stun the thing and get an opening for the blade. The captain completely skipped the light and medium weapons section, knowing there could possibly... The captain completely skipped the light and medium weapons section, knowing there was nothing there that could possibly hurt the creature. But even the heavy sections were worryingly underpowered. EMPs would not work. The monster was clearly augmented, and even basic augmenters were made to be EMP-proof, so the people with synthetic limbs and organs didn't die because some idiot decided to try and turn off his neighbor's lights. Grenades wouldn't do much either. The thing had just slammed into the door like it was nothing. Clearly, it didn't. Clearly, it didn't care about silly things like concussive force. It was covered in metal, so any fragments would just bounce off. Wait, it was covered in metal. Rapax reached the shock ballista. The thing was almost as tall as him, and it could be barely considered a soldier's weapon, as it was more akin to a handheld artillery gun. The sheer kick of it was enough to knock cold an unprepared fighter, and the destruction caused by the weapon almost 1 kilo projectile. The weapon's almost 1 kilo projectile being launched at void knows what was fast enough to break some holes, and that didn't even take into account the electricity carried inside the projectile. It had the very well-deserved title as the kill every fucker in that general direction weapon among the pirates, mercenaries, and soldiers alike. Rapax aimed the weapon and waited to hear the creature attacking the door, all while praying that the door could hold out at least one more charge. No charge came. Instead, Rapax watched in horror as the door that protected him from certain death started to glow red, then orange, then white. After what felt like an eternity of seeing his defenses literally melting, but was probably only a few seconds in reality, the ballista was charged. Rapax pulled the trigger. Kane was burning inside. Not in the metaphorical sense. He was literally burning inside. He screamed as loud as his lungs allowed him, and when the air from them He screamed as loud as his lungs allowed him, and when the air from them ran out, he stood there, gasping for air as the electricity running through his flesh and bones dissipated at a rate that seemed way too low for his liking. But it did eventually dissipate from his body, and he didn't like what had happened to said body. All of his chest armor had been smashed to the point where it was useless. Most of the other armor he had was damaged or misplaced, and at least half of his general modifications, like improved reflex, had been damaged, and another quarter had fried. Not good. He dared to look at the room he was just about to invade. The door was just gone. Bits of still red metal covered the ground, and some had literally fused to the walls. Inside the room stood a cloaked figure who looked just as stunned as Kane. It didn't take long for him to make the connection between the stunned captain and the giant gun in the middle of the room, and soon Kane came to the sensible conclusion that he must have been shot by some kind of portable artillery. The engineer part of his mind almost laughed at the idea that he had somehow made modifications strong enough to survive a point-blank shot from an artillery weapon out of scrap metal and spare parts. The dying part inside of him made it clear that laughing was not an option. He slowly stood up again and aimed the fire blade at the captain. He pressed the trigger. He pressed again. He had no fuel. Fuck. The moment the word came out of his mouth, he regretted saying it. His mouth and neck were not okay enough to allow him to speak. He could feel Jane's nanites buzzing in his bloodstream, trying their hardest to keep him alive, but even those things had their limits. He checked the modifications again. All of his backup weapons were gone, and he had forgotten to take any of the pirates' weapons because he assumed they weren't going to be a problem. And now the captain was standing up, with his vibroblade at his side. Shit. Kane checked his systems one last time for something. Anything. Nothing. Oh, good enough. Rapax slowly stood up. He felt as if his entire body had just been reversed. His ears were making a horrible screeching sound that he knew wasn't healthy. His eyes were bleary, and he had the sensation that thousands of insects were crawling through his skin. Why did he have the stupid idea of using a shock ballista in a small room without any ear or eye protection? Oh, right, the Rapax could now see it fully. Not the blurry image of death that he thought it would be, but for what it really was. It was a human revenant. Every child heard stories about revenants. being so wronged in life that they cannot wait for another wrongdoer's judgment day, and thus became monsters, ungodly creations made out of corpses, stone, and metal. Revenants were a common element in his nightmares. But he had doubted that he would wake up from this one if he tried pinching himself. The captain raised his vibroblade and took a step forward. This was all his fault, and he knew it. His men were dead because he was irresponsible. He decided to invade that human ship. He decided to give Friggin a level of autonomy he knew the man was just wasn't ready for. He decided not to bury the corpses of the men and women slaughtered on that ship out of shame and fear of being discovered by the Alliance. The Revenant was his judge, and he was ready to be judged. He ran towards the Revenant as fast as his wobbly legs would take him, vibroblade ready. Kane was not having a good time. He was still quite stunned when he saw the captain running in his direction and barely had time to dodge the attack from the vibroblade. He had to dodge 3 more attacks until the nanites finally finished fixing his only weapon. Abel's arm suddenly released a thin, incredibly sharp blade. The thing was short and not very wide. It barely extended 10 centimeters from Abel's fist. It would have to do the job. The captain seemed to be caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the modified surgical blade, something that Kane took advantage of by slashing his opponent's left leg. The captain screamed and moved away from Kane's blade, positioned his own weapon between them. Kane tried his best to analyze the situation. He was at a very serious disadvantage now. He bet that his armor could have probably survived the vibroblade long enough for him to finish the captain if it hadn't been destroyed previously. Now, with how damaged it was, the enemy's weapon wouldn't so much as slow down when it met his body. He had almost lost too much of his speed and reflexes during his body's makeout session with the lightning bolt. But the captain was far from okay either. The man was shaking, his hands unsteady and his legs bleeding at a dangerous rate. Kane could have left, let the man bleed, and then come back to finish him off later. Like a coward. No. Kane was many things. Mad? Certainly. Stupid? Possibly. But he was not a coward. He narrowed his eyes and charged the captain. Rapax was having a very bad time. His body was shaking, his vision seemed awfully blurry, and now the Revenant had just created a blade out of thin air and stabbed him with it. And now he was charging. Oh, this was going to be painful. The captain repositioned his vibroblade so that it intercepted the Revenant's attack, and while he was successful in doing so, it did leave him quite open for another attack, a mistake which the human monster rewarded with a punch to the captain's side. The punch was hard, but the captain stood his ground and waited for an opening. The Revenant, seemingly dissatisfied with the results from its punch, decided to try again. Just as Rapax attended. The moment his opponent drew his hand back for another attack, the captain lunged with his sword. The creature dodged the blade, but was seemingly too distracted to notice the captain's right leg as it kicked the creature's organic knee, making the Revenant fall. Unfortunately for the captain, he had forgotten that his own leg wasn't very well at the moment, and now without its healthy partner to hold it up, his left leg decided to imitate the Revenant's example and let him fall to the ground. Fuck. Rapax grabbed into the vibroblade with all his might and swung it at the Revenant, hoping to finish it before it could get a hold of itself. It worked. Kind of. He hit the Revenant in its organic arm. The blood-curdling scream that came out of its mouth made it clear that he had caused some major damage, but major damage for a normal person probably wasn't the same as major damage to the Revenant. Based on how much of its blood was mechanical, it was completely possible the thing was immune to death by blood loss. But that wasn't his biggest problem at the moment. His biggest problem was the very big piece of metal inside his stomach. Kane was dying. It was a simple fact. His entire body was broken. The camera that was one of his eyes was little more than a glass ball now that its circuits were fried. His right leg was broken after his opponent's surprise attack. His body had more broken armor pieces than intact ones, and even those that were intact were also in very incorrect places. Oh, and more than half of his arm was missing. But it was done. He could see the captain was not in much better shape. That's what happened when 10 centimeters of sharp metal decide they wanted to make your guts their new home. Kane had done it. After weeks of suffering, after uncountable sleepless nights, it was finally done. So why did he feel so empty? Rapax had failed. The Revenant, the mythological creature that came to judge him in life, was still alive. What would it do once he died? It had killed all of his crew in cold blood. It could try to do the same to others. Or it could simply roam through his ship for the rest of eternity, trapped in the mortal realm where no one would ever find it and release it from its vessel. He couldn't allow either possibility. The first would lead to the death of dozens, and the second would be simply cruel. The Revenant was simply a manifestation of vengefulness from the humans. Vengefulness they were fully entitled to after all Friggin, and thus Rapax, had made them go through. The Revenant deserved rest. Rapax activated the self-destruct sequence and closed his eyes. It was time to face the ones he wronged. Kane stood, and he could hear the self-destruct sequence blaring in his ears. He didn't care. The engineer looked at himself, or what was left of himself anyway. He didn't enjoy it. He thought about what he was supposed to do next. He couldn't think of anything. The sequence kept going. He only had a few seconds now. He fixed his posture as best he could and filled his chest. A soldier dies standing, after all. The thought made him chuckle. He never understood why aliens told histories about humans being hard to kill. Now that he was about to die because an entire pirate ship couldn't contain him, well, he somewhat understood why. There was nothing harder to kill than an angry human with nothing to lose. That was his last thought as the whole fragments and vacuum consumed him.